Hello, 5th grade. We are on a new unit today. We are on Domain 8, Native Americans, Lesson 1, A Changing World. Our objectives are to determine the meaning of words and phrases from the text about Native American tribes that lived in different regions. We're also going to use details from the text to understand and draw inferences about the impact European settlers and explorers had on the lives of Native Americans. Some key vocabulary. Assume is to believe something is true despite not knowing all the facts. Conflict is disagreement. Conflict is also to disagree, differ, or say or do the opposite of something. Diverse is made up of people or items that are not alike. Imply is to suggest something that without saying it directly. An inference is a conclusion or view that comes from knowing some but not all of the facts. Trace is to follow along or draw the outline of something, to examine the history of something to see how it is developed. And vary is to change something from time to time. So we're going to begin a unit called Native Americans, and in the reader, the chapter or the whole book is called A Changing Landscape. So before we read it, we're going to talk about some key components of this unit. So one of the key components of this unit is about the regions in which Native Americans lived. So their day-to-day activities, the way their homes were built, and the food that they were given was primarily based on where they lived. For example, if the weather was warm, they had to adapt to that environment. If the weather's cold, they have to adapt to that environment. And it also changes the resources that is provided to them. So the Native Americans are the earliest known groups of people that lived in North America. So they lived a nomadic lifestyle, which means they traveled from place to place in order to search for food. Now, because of where they adapted or where they lived, the food was hard to come by, so they had to be able to travel around a lot to find what they needed. So this allowed them to travel and spread out throughout the continent and change as the environment changed. Now, eventually, a lot of them settled down, but some of the tribes still are very nomadic. And there are still Native American tribes that still live there today. So we're going to focus on 4 geographic regions for these Native Americans. We're going to talk about the Northeast, which is over here, the Great Plains, which is here, the Pacific Northwest, which is up here, and the Southwest, which is down here. As you notice, you can tell from the landscape of this that it changes how these Native Americans adapted. So for example, if you notice, the Great Plains is in the center of the North America. There's not a lot of water. So that impacts how they get their resources. With Southwest, they're towards the south, which means it's going to be hotter, so they have to adapt to that as well. Northeast. So in this region, the Iroquois made the forest their home, and they had an abundance of freshwater rivers and lakes, also including mountains. And obviously, the seasons made it so they had to adapt to the different seasons. So they had a lot of trees, so they were able to build long houses out of the wood and also build shelters during the cold winter months. In the spring, they were able to plant corn, beans, and squash, and there was a lot of rain, so they had a lot of help with that for their crops. Now, in the wintertime, it was a lot harder to come by food, so a lot of times these Iroquois would leave their villages to go hunt for deer or rabbits. What's also great is they lived near water, which was not just obviously a source of life, but it was a source of transportation. They would hollow out wood to make canoes and travel through that, or they would fish using nets and traps. Now, the Great Plains is a different region. So this region was very arid and not a lot of trees. There wasn't really very much there. So this was a key place for the nomadic Native Americans to be. The reason that this area was so popular was because it was an overabundant amount of buffalo. There were over 30 million buffalo that roamed this part of North America, and Native Americans used every bit of the buffalo. So they used it for food, clothes, their place they lived in, and they used every piece of it. So they tended to travel in this area to find these buffalo for them to survive. Now, instead of, as I said, there isn't a lot of trees, so they also use soil, grass, and roots to make their houses. The Pacific Northwest had a lot of forests and waters available, so they were able to use the cedar trees to make plank houses and also, obviously, boats. They had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, so the men often hunted, and since they didn't need to farm because they could hunt for food, they were able to catch a lot of salmon while they were fishing. They used the baskets, nets, spears, harpoons, anyway, because salmon was the most popular fish during this time and in this area. Now, obviously, there was a few months that they couldn't get to the fish, so they had to supplement it by hunting bigger animals, and sometimes they would even hunt for whales and seals. The women, on the other hand, they were the gatherers. They hunted for roots, berries, grains. They looked around for it. They didn't have to actually hunt it. They had to search for it. That's why they're called the gatherers. They were collecting. And now the Southwest. As you can tell from this picture, it's hot. So in this time, there wasn't a lot of options for what they needed, so there was a very small water supply. So they were able to kind of figure out how to grow things with very little water. They built their houses of clay, bricks, and stone, and they figured out how to do it on multi-levels. They also were very known for their stonework, their basket weaving, and their pottery. And they carefully wove these baskets, then they coated them with mud and baked them in the sun, and that caused like an actual basin, which was good for cooking, carrying water, and storing crops. They were also really good at harvesting and planting cotton, and they determined that cotton is a lot lighter of a material to wear during this climate, and so it made it a little bit more comfortable in that hot sun. And we will see everyone in our part 2 of lesson 1.